Okay, everyone, welcome to Yoga Sutra Study. We're going to dive right in and start talking about our very first concept, which is presence. What I want to say about this is that this concept of presence, I like to think about it as a state of mind. When we are in the present moment, we are able to have a state of mind that allows us to be present. And in order to be present or maintain a state of mind or a state of presence, that requires a skill, and that skill is focus. And that's what we will look at in the next video. So this very first concept that we're exploring is this concept of presence. And to talk about this concept of presence, we're going to look at two yoga sutras. The first is a yoga sutra in the very first chapter, Sutra 1.1, and the second sutra that we'll be looking at is a sutra in the fourth chapter, Sutra 4.12 or 412. So let's start with Sutra 1.1. The common translation of this sutra is "Now the teaching of yoga begins." I like to think of it as "Now yoga begins." And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But first, let's unpack the words in this very first sutra. It's pretty straightforward. There's not anything too crazy about this particular sutra in terms of not really understanding exactly what it means. But I want to spend a little time talking about the very first word, now. In Sanskrit, this word is atha, A-T-H-A. And as we know, Sanskrit is a challenging language to translate into English. And this word atha, or now, it has many different meanings. Not that it means different things, but that there are many different contexts that are present in this word atha. We're going to talk about a couple of those different contexts and how they might apply here. So first, I want you to go back to middle school, high school, maybe even college when you were learning how to write. And I went to school and studied journalism in college. So when I was studying journalism, we always learned how to write a lead sentence. That very first sentence of any news article is supposed to be the most important sentence in the entire article. And it's supposed to convey the entire meaning of whatever it is that you're about to read. Similarly, hopefully, when you were learning how to write those 5-paragraph essays or research papers, the very first sentence is meant to set up the entire argument for your whole paper. Now, the Yoga Sutra is written in a very specific style, which is part of the reason why it makes it challenging to read. And it is set up in this style that allows for each individual aphorism or short statement to both stand on its own, but also be part of a larger group of sutras, so that you could read one individual sutra and get something from it and not need any of the sutras before or after it. But when put together with other sutras, you get a bigger picture or more of a nuanced meaning. Now, for the very first sutra of the entire text, and this is true not just for the Yoga Sutra, but for all texts that were written in this style, that first sentence should convey the entire meaning of the whole text. Talk about a complicated, challenging task. How do you describe what the entire text of the Yoga Sutra means in one sentence or one word? Patanjali did it. Now the teaching of yoga begins, and specifically now. That very first word immediately anchors us into the present moment. Now is describing a point in time, not the past, not the future, right now. So we are immediately put into the present moment, and this very first sutra conveys to us everything that we need to know about yoga, which is that yoga helps us find presence. And this is so powerful. To be present allows us to, you could argue, be enlightened. Certainly, there's no way to reach an enlightened state in a distracted state of mind. So Now, ata becomes vastly important as a word in this particular first sutra. The other interesting thing about this word is that it allows for there to be a little bit of a prayer. This is another one of the contexts of this particular word. Now the teaching of yoga begins. And what is unsaid is that we hope that your journey learning yoga is an auspicious one, that you are successful on this journey, that you learn with an open mind. And in that way, this particular first sentence or first sutra does act as a prayer, does act as a way for us to settle into our seat, not just for meditation, but for learning, for reading about the Yoga Sutra. And we know that it's a challenging task, and it's going to require a lot of presence and focus. And we hope that in offering these teachings, or Patanjali hopes that in offering these teachings, you can have an auspicious journey. You can get benefit out of this particular text. You can release suffering. So it's nice to think about this particular sutra as a prayer or a wish as well. And finally, it can be read as a mantra, and that's where I really like this now yoga begins, because it makes a little bit more sense throughout the course of our life when we are trying to remind ourselves that we need to be present. When we're in a state of distraction, that's often happening because we are experiencing challenges in our life, because there are things going on that are outside of our control. It spikes our anxiety. We aren't sure exactly what's going on. There's times of uncertainty. There's obstacles that we're facing. And so then we get distracted. And it's really hard to get back to that present moment, to get back into that focus. If we use this first sutra as a mantra, we can then repeat it to ourselves when we find ourselves facing those challenging situations. Now yoga begins. And what I found is that this works in almost any setting. So think about it. Currently, right now, when I'm recording this, we are in the very beginnings of this whole coronavirus global pandemic. And it has thrown everything into this vast sea of uncertainty. And so there is no better time than to use this mantra, now yoga begins. What are we going to do? We're going to use the tools of yoga to try and help us get through this. So it works in this particular specific example. But what happens when you get a brand new job? That isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be really exciting, but it also brings with it new challenges, new situations. So we can come back to this mantra, now yoga begins. Take some deep breaths, remain present, and you'll get through this. When you have a baby, parenting is such a yogic journey. There's nothing else you can do except remind yourself, now yoga begins. In this moment when I'm feeling stressed, anxious, uncertain, doubt, any of these emotions, coming back to this mantra, now yoga begins, is a really wonderful way to bring us back into the present moment, to remind us we have the tools we need to get through, and to then utilize those tools to help us face our obstacles with confidence and strength and ease. And that's what yoga is. That is what yoga is without the asana, without the movement. It is how we are choosing to show up and respond to each individual present moment in our daily life. And there are a lot of them, so many opportunities to practice yoga every single moment. Now yoga begins when you experience the death of a loved one. Now yoga begins when you are facing a deadline at work and you're feeling really stressed. Now yoga begins when you step onto your mat to teach a yoga class, or when you step on your mat to take a yoga class. In every single moment, we can come back to this very first sutra to remind us it's time to get present. The one last thing that I want to say about this particular sutra, now the teaching of yoga begins, or now yoga begins, is that word now, this last context that I want to present to you, does presuppose that there is some collective understanding or knowledge that you have before you start reading this text. And that brings up the question of, is yoga for everybody? Now, we hear this a lot, especially in the conversations around accessibility and inclusivity for yoga. Of course, we want yoga to be accessible to everyone. We want yoga to be inclusive, and we do want yoga to be a practice for everyone. But the way that this is written is basically saying there are some prerequisites that you need to understand before you can jump into this text. And when this text was written thousands and thousands of years ago, there was the assumption that that collective understanding was already there because it was a societal understanding based on the way that people lived thousands of years ago. So you would have had to understand certain cultural understandings, certain ways of being in the world that in our Western context today in 2020, we don't have those same understandings. And that is part of what makes the Yoga Sutra really difficult to understand, because a lot of us are coming into reading this text without a foundational knowledge of what some of these concepts that are being referenced in the sutra mean, and the sutra isn't explaining those concepts. So those prerequisites that are required to really understand this text are understanding some of the Samkhya yoga philosophy that yoga is, or some of the Samkhya, philosophy that yoga is based off of. These ideas of Purusha and Prakriti and the gunas, some of the ideas presented in the Upanishads or in Vedic philosophy and a Vedic worldview. Those are things that people thousands of years ago that were educated would already know or have already been taught before they were presented something like the Yoga Sutra. And a lot of us are diving into this text without having that prerequisite knowledge. So it's requiring us to kind of go back and figure out what these different concepts and ideas mean as we come across them in the sutra. And they're hard and challenging concepts because they often challenge our own Western understanding, our own cultural understanding that we have now in 2020, our own belief systems in some cases. So just know that there is some prerequisite knowledge that is assumed that you already understand, which is why the Yoga Sutra does not explain a lot of these concepts that you might be unfamiliar with. It's assumed that you already know what they mean. And we don't know what they mean. A lot of us don't, because we haven't had that teaching yet. We haven't taken the time to dive into understanding those concepts. So we're going to dive into some of those concepts and parse some of that out in one of the upcoming modules. But I just want you to know that it's okay if you don't understand all of this. It's okay if some of these concepts and ideas are new to you. It's okay if they're very confusing. It's okay if you've read this a bunch of times and you still don't understand. It's okay. The best that we can do is just keep coming back to this now yoga begins. And that will help keep us in the present moment. And if we can stay in the present moment, then there's nothing else to worry about. Easier said than done, definitely. But what a powerful, simple teaching that we can share with our students over and over again in the practices that we teach, whether that's asana, meditation, philosophy lectures, however it is that we choose to go out into the world and share the practices of yoga. This is a beautiful, powerful, impactful, simple lesson.